The scorching sun of the American Southwest beat down mercilessly on the endless grasslands, creating waves of heat that danced across the horizon like ghostly spirits. Thomas McKenna, a weathered cowboy of 28, guided his chestnut mare through the rolling prairie with practiced ease. His worn leather chaps bore the dust of countless miles, and his blue eyes held the quiet determination of a man seeking honest work in an unforgiving land. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on packed earth was the only companion he had known for weeks, save for the occasional cry of a distant hawk circling overhead. As Thomas crested a small hill, the glint of water caught his attention. Lake Serenity stretched before him, its surface reflecting the brilliant azure sky like a mirror. He was contemplating whether to rest his mount when a sound pierced the afternoon stillness. A woman's voice, raw with desperation and terror. The cry echoed across the water, carrying with it a pain so profound that Thomas felt his heart clench. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse toward the source of the anguish. What he discovered near the lake's edge would haunt him for the rest of his days. In the crystal-clear water, partially concealed by cattails and water lilies, stood a young Apache woman. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall of midnight, providing the only modesty she possessed. Her dark eyes, wide with fear and humiliation, locked onto his with a mixture of desperation and wariness. She trembled not from the cool water, but from the vulnerability of her situation. "They stole my clothes. Cowboy, please help me," she cried out, her voice breaking with each word. The English flowed from her lips with only the slightest accent, revealing an education that spoke of time spent among white settlers. Her arms wrapped protectively around herself as tears streamed down her bronze cheeks. Thomas immediately averted his gaze, his face flushing with both anger and embarrassment. On the muddy bank, the evidence of recent violence was clear. Boot prints in the soft earth, scattered wildflowers trampled underfoot, and in the distance, the fading sound of raucous laughter carried on the wind. 3 sets of tracks led away from the lake toward the main trail, where dust clouds suggested riders moving at a hurried pace. The young cowboy faced a moment that would define his character. He could easily ride away, avoiding the complications that would surely follow any involvement with this situation. The smart move would be to pretend he had seen nothing, heard nothing. After all, conflicts between white men and Apache rarely ended well for anyone involved. Yet as he looked at this woman's tear-stained face, her dignity shattered but her spirit unbroken, Thomas McKenna knew he could not turn his back on someone in need. "Ma'am, I'm going to throw you my jacket," Thomas called out, already shrugging out of his worn brown leather coat. "Don't you worry none. I ain't looking, and I ain't going nowhere until we figure this out." He tossed the garment toward the water's edge, where it landed on a flat rock within her reach. The Apache woman's eyes never left his face as she moved carefully through the water. Thomas kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched tight with barely controlled rage. Whoever had done this to her would answer for it, he silently vowed. In this harsh land where survival often required setting aside civilized behavior, there were still lines that decent men did not cross. Thomas McKenna had no way of knowing that this moment of moral choice would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, love, and the meaning of home. The woman in the water was no ordinary victim, and the consequences of his decision to help her would ripple far beyond this quiet lake, ultimately transforming the lives of everyone involved. The Apache woman wrapped Thomas's jacket around herself like a shield, the heavy leather providing both warmth and dignity. As she emerged from the water, her bare feet found purchase on the smooth stones of the shoreline. Up close, Thomas could see she was perhaps 25, with high cheekbones and intelligent eyes that spoke of strength despite her current vulnerability. Her hair, now drying in the desert breeze, gleamed like polished obsidian. "My name is Running Deer," she said softly, her voice steadier now but still edged with pain. "Those men, they came while I was bathing. 3 of them, drunk on whiskey and meanness." She pulled the jacket tighter around herself, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Thomas nodded grimly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Thomas McKenna, ma'am, and I'm real sorry this happened to you." He gestured toward the tracks in the mud. "These the varmints who did this?" Running Deer followed his gaze and nodded. "They took everything: my dress, my moccasins, my medicine pouch, they laughed and said. She paused, unable to continue as fresh tears threatened to spill. You don't need to say it, Thomas interrupted gently. Some men ain't fit to call themselves men at all. He studied the tracks more carefully, noting the distinctive pattern of one boot that had a broken sole. How long ago did they leave? Perhaps an hour, Running Deer replied. They rode toward Dry Creek. There is a saloon there where such men gather to drink and boast of their cruelties. Thomas felt the weight of decision pressing down upon him. Confronting three armed men would be dangerous enough, but doing so on behalf of an Apache woman could easily turn the entire town against him. Yet, as he looked at Running Deer's proud bearing despite her humiliation, he knew there was no other choice his conscience would allow. Ma'am, I'm going to get your belongings back, Thomas declared, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had made up his mind. But first, let's get you somewhere safe and see about finding you something proper to wear. Running Deer studied his face intently, as if trying to read the truth written in his weathered features. Why would you do this for me, Thomas McKenna? Your people and mine. We are not friends. The honesty of her question struck him like a physical blow. She was right, of course. The history between white settlers and Apache tribes was written in blood and broken treaties. Yet here they stood, two human beings beside a peaceful lake, and none of that history seemed to matter in the face of basic human decency. Because it's the right thing to do, Thomas replied simply. And because no woman Apache, white, or any other should have to suffer what you've suffered today. For the first time since he had found her, Running Deer's expression softened. The wariness didn't entirely leave her eyes, but something else joined it. A cautious hope that perhaps not all white men were cut from the same cloth as her tormentors. Thomas led his horse to a nearby grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling in the afternoon breeze. From his saddlebags, he produced a clean shirt and a pair of canvas pants. These'll be too big, but they're better than nothing, he said, laying the clothes on a fallen log. I'll wait over by the horses while you get dressed. As Running Deer changed clothes, Thomas found himself staring at the tracks in the mud with growing anger. The broken boot print belonged to someone he might be able to identify if he could get a good look at the man's footwear. The other two sets of tracks showed horses shod at different smithies, giving him additional clues to work with. I am ready, Running Deer called softly. Thomas turned to find her wearing his clothes, the shirt hanging loose on her slender frame and the pants rolled up to accommodate her shorter stature. Despite the ill-fitting garments, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her long hair was now braided in a practical style that kept it out of her face, and her dark eyes held a determination that matched his own. We'll head to Dry Creek, Thomas said, helping her up onto his horse, but I want you to stay back while I deal with these men. This could get ugly fast. Running Deer settled into the saddle behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. These men, they are dangerous. They will not give up my belongings willingly. Then they'll find out what happens when decent folks get tired of their behavior, Thomas replied, spurring his horse toward the main trail. The ride to Dry Creek took them through increasingly harsh terrain. The prairie grass gave way to rocky outcroppings and sparse desert vegetation. In the distance, the town's buildings wavered in the heat like a mirage, their weathered wood siding bleached nearly white by years of relentless Sunday. The settlement was typical of frontier towns, a main street lined with essential businesses, surrounded by a collection of hastily built structures that served the needs of ranchers, miners, and drifters passing through. The Golden Dollar Saloon sat at the heart of Dry Creek's main street, its batwing doors hanging open to catch any breeze that might offer relief from the heat. Even from a distance, Thomas could hear the sounds of raucous conversation and clinking glasses that meant business was brisk despite the early hour. As they approached the edge of town, Thomas reined in his horse and turned to Running Deer. I mean what I said about staying back. These men have already shown they ain't got any respect for decency. I don't want them getting another chance to hurt you. Running Deer's eyes flashed with something that might have been irritation. I am not helpless, Thomas McKenna. My people have survived in this land for generations. We know how to fight when fighting is needed. Thomas couldn't help but smile at the fire in her voice. I don't doubt that for a second, ma'am. But this is my fight now, and I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd let me handle it my way. After a moment's consideration, Running Deer nodded. Very well, but if you need help, you will have it. Thomas dismounted and checked his weapons, a Colt 45 on his hip and a Winchester rifle in his saddle boot. Both were well maintained and had served him faithfully through years of hard use. He prayed he wouldn't need either today, but experience had taught him that prayers weren't always answered the way a man hoped. The interior of the Golden Dollar was exactly what Thomas had expected: rough-hewn tables, a bar made from a single massive plank of oak, and the lingering smell of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey. Coal oil lamps provided inadequate lighting, leaving the corners of the room in perpetual shadow. A handful of patrons nursed their drinks in sullen silence, while three men at the far end of the bar were engaged in animated conversation punctuated by bursts of cruel laughter. Thomas recognized them immediately. The largest of the three wore boots with a distinctive crack across the sole of the left foot, the same pattern he had seen in the mud beside the lake. All three men bore the weathered look of ranch hands, but their clothes were too clean and their hands too soft for honest work. These were men who lived on the margins, taking what they wanted through intimidation and violence. "Afternoon, boys," Thomas said casually as he approached the bar. "Beautiful day for a ride, ain't it?" The three men turned to regard him with the lazy arrogance of predators who had never met their match. The largest, a bearded man with cruel eyes, grinned widely. "Why, it surely is, stranger. Name's Buck Morrison. These here are my associates, Pete and Jimmy." Thomas nodded politely but kept his hand near his gun. "Thomas McKenna. I'm looking for some folks who might have passed through here recently." Three men who had themselves a real good laugh down by Lake Serenity. The change in the men's demeanor was immediate and telling. Buck's grin widened, but his eyes turned cold as winter. "Well now, that's an interesting story you're telling, friend. What makes you think we'd know anything about that?" "Oh, I got a feeling you boys know plenty about it," Thomas replied, his voice remaining conversational despite the tension crackling in the air. "See, there was a lady down there who had some belongings go missing. I'm here to get them back." Pete, a thin man with a scraggly mustache, let out a harsh laugh. "A lady, you say? Funny, all we saw was some dirty Apache girl playing in the water like a child." The racial slur hung in the air like a challenge, and Thomas felt his control slipping. Every instinct screamed at him to draw his gun and settle this the quick way. Instead, he forced himself to remain calm. Violence might be necessary, but it would be a last resort. "That lady's belongings," Thomas said quietly. "I'd be much obliged if you'd return them." Jimmy, the youngest of the three, seemed nervous about the direction the conversation was heading. "Look, mister, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Jimmy," Buck snarled, never taking his eyes off Thomas. "This here's between me and the Apache lover." The saloon fell silent as other patrons sensed the approaching confrontation. The bartender, a gray-haired man with intelligent eyes, quietly moved the bottle of whiskey out of potential harm's way. "I'm going to ask one more time," Thomas said, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "Where are the lady's belongings?" Buck Morrison's hand moved toward his own weapon, but something in Thomas's eyes made him pause. This wasn't some green kid looking for glory. This was a man who had seen trouble before and wasn't afraid of it. "You really want to die for some Apache squaw?" Buck asked, trying to regain the psychological advantage. "I'm prepared to die for what's right," Thomas replied evenly. "Question is, are you prepared to die for what's wrong?" The standoff stretched for long seconds, with both men calculating odds and possibilities. Finally, Buck's nerve broke. He had bullied plenty of people in his time, but something about Thomas McKenna suggested that this fight wouldn't end the way his usual confrontations did. "Pete, go get the girls' things from my saddlebags," Buck ordered, his voice tight with frustrated anger. But Buck Pete protested. "Just do it!" Buck roared. Minutes later, Pete returned with Running Deer's belongings, a beautifully crafted dawskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, a pair of soft moccasins, and a small leather pouch that clinked softly with whatever treasures it contained. Thomas examined the items carefully, noting the quality of the craftsmanship and the care with which they had been made. "Much obliged," he said, gathering up the belongings. "Now, I suggest you boys find yourselves a new place to drink. This town might not be big enough for all of us much longer." Buck Morrison's face flushed red with rage. "This ain't over, McKenna. Not by a long shot." Thomas met his glare steadily. "No, I don't expect it is. But next time you boys decide to have some fun at a lady's expense, You might want to remember what happened here today." As Thomas backed toward the saloon doors, he could feel the hatred radiating from the three men like heat from a forge. He had won this round, but the cost would be higher than he had anticipated. Men like Buck Morrison didn't forget slights, and they rarely fought fair when they came looking for revenge. Outside the saloon, Running Deer waited anxiously beside Thomas's horse. Her relief was visible as he approached with her belongings, but her expression quickly turned serious as she studied his face. "There will be trouble," she observed. Thomas nodded grimly. "Those boys ain't the type to let this slide. We need to put some distance between us and them, and we need to do it fast." Running Deer took her belongings gratefully, holding the medicine pouch close to her heart. "There is a place I know, perhaps half a day's ride from here. My people sometimes camp there when hunting. We would be safe." "Your people?" Thomas asked, suddenly realizing how little he knew about the woman he had chosen to help. Running Deer looked away, as if debating how much to reveal. "It is complicated, Thomas McKenna. But yes, I have people who would offer us shelter." Something in her tone suggested there was more to this story than she was telling, but Thomas decided that questions could wait. Right now, their priority was getting away from Dry Creek before Buck Morrison and his friends decided to settle their differences with bullets. They rode hard for the first hour, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the town. The landscape gradually changed from desert scrub to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pines. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Running Deer guided them toward a hidden canyon that opened like a secret door in the red rock cliffs. The canyon was a place of unexpected beauty. A small stream ran through its center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock walls. Cottonwood trees provided shade, and the walls themselves offered protection from both the elements and prying eyes. It was clearly a place that had been used by travelers for many years, as evidenced by the carefully constructed fire ring and the smooth stones arranged as seating. "This place is sacred to my people," Running Deer explained as they made camp. "The spirits of the water and stone watch over those who rest here." Thomas nodded respectfully, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. His own relationship with the divine was simpler. He believed in treating people right and trusting that things would work out as they were meant to. But he could feel the peace of this place, the sense that it was somehow set apart from the violence and ugliness of the outside world. As darkness fell, they sat beside a small fire, sharing jerky and hardtack from Thomas's supplies. The flames cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, and the sound of the stream provided a soothing counterpoint to their quiet conversation. "Tell me about your family," Thomas said gently. Running Deer was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father is a leader among our people. Not the greatest chief, but respected for his wisdom and his efforts to find a path of peace between our worlds." Thomas sensed there was more to this revelation than she was letting on. "And what would he think about you being here with me?" "He would be concerned," Running Deer admitted. "There are many among my people who believe that any contact with whites brings only sorrow and destruction. They have seen too much betrayal, too many broken promises." "And what do you believe?" Thomas asked. Running Deer studied his face in the firelight. "I believed as they did, until today. You could have ridden away and left me to my shame. Instead, you risked danger to help someone you had never seen before. Perhaps there are good people among all races." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I hope I can prove worthy of that faith, ma'am." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their different worlds. Thomas spoke of growing up on a small ranch in Texas, of losing his parents to fever when he was 16, of the lonely years that followed as he worked whatever jobs he could find. Running Deer told him of life in the Apache camps, of learning the old ways from her grandmother, of watching the white settlements grow larger and more numerous each year. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered common ground in their love of the land, their respect for hard work, and their belief that people should be judged by their actions rather than their appearance. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, both began to realize that the events of the day had forged a connection between them that went far deeper than gratitude. Thomas woke before dawn to find Running Deer already up, standing at the mouth of the canyon and looking out over the desert. She had changed back into her Apache dress, and in the soft morning light, she looked like something from a dream, beautiful, mysterious, and somehow unattainable. "Bad news?" he asked, joining her at her lookout point. "Dust clouds on the horizon," she replied, pointing toward the east. "Three riders moving fast in this direction." Thomas squinted against the rising sun and could just make out the telltale signs of approaching horsemen. His jaw tightened as he recognized the implications. Buck Morrison ain't the type to give up easy. "We should run," Running Deer said simply. Thomas considered this option, but something in him rebelled against the idea of running from men like Morrison. "Maybe it's time to end this once and for all." Running Deer turned to look at him sharply. "3 against 1 are not good odds, even for a man as brave as you." "3 against 2? Thomas corrected. "I seem to remember you saying you weren't helpless." A smile tugged at the corners of Running Deer's mouth. "You would trust me to fight beside you?" "Ma'am, after yesterday, I'd trust you with my life." They spent the next hour preparing for the confrontation. The canyon provided excellent defensive positions, with plenty of cover among the rocks and clear sightlines toward the entrance. Thomas positioned himself behind a large boulder that commanded the main approach, while Running Deer took a position higher up on the canyon wall where she could observe the entire area. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls as Buck Morrison and his companions rode into view. They had come prepared for trouble, with rifles at the ready, and hard expressions that spoke of violent intentions. "McKenna," Buck's voice boomed through the canyon. "We know you're in there. Come on out and face us like a man." Thomas remained silent, letting them wonder where he was and what he was planning. Uncertainty would make them nervous, and nervous men made mistakes. "Maybe they ain't here after all," Pete suggested, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "They're here," Buck snarled. "Their tracks lead right into this canyon, and there ain't no other way out." Jimmy, who had been studying the canyon walls, suddenly pointed upward. "Buck, look there." All three men looked up to see Running Deer standing openly on a rocky ledge, her Apache dress and long black hair making her clearly visible against the redstone. She showed no fear, no sign of wanting to hide or run. "Well, well," Buck called out. "If it ain't our little Apache princess, why don't you come down here and finish what we started yesterday?" Running Deer's voice rang out clear and strong. "Why don't you come up here and try to take me, if you have the courage?" The taunt had its intended effect. Buck Morrison was not a man who could let a challenge pass, especially from a woman he considered his inferior. He spurred his horse forward into the canyon, his companions following reluctantly behind. Thomas let them get about halfway to the back of the canyon before he made his move. Standing up from behind his boulder, he called out in a voice that stopped all three men cold. "That's far enough, boys." The effect was electric. 3 rifles swung toward him, but Thomas already had his Winchester leveled and ready. At this range, he couldn't miss, and they all knew it. "Drop the weapons," Thomas ordered. Buck Morrison's face was purple with rage. "You think you can take all 3 of us?" "I don't think," Thomas replied calmly. "I know. Question is, which one of you wants to find out what it feels like to be first?" For a moment, it seemed as though Buck might actually be foolish enough to try it. His finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle, and Thomas prepared to fire. Then Jimmy, clearly the smartest of the 3, slowly lowered his weapon. "I ain't dying for this," Jimmy announced. Pete, seeing his companion surrender, followed suit. This left Buck Morrison alone, facing a man who had already proven he wouldn't back down. "You're making a mistake, McKenna," Buck said, but his rifle was also lowering. "The only mistake I made was letting you boys walk away yesterday," Thomas replied. "This ends here and now." Running Deer's voice came from above. "Thomas McKenna speaks truth. This must end." Buck Morrison looked up at her with undisguised hatred. "You think this is over? You think you can humiliate me and just walk away?" "I think," Thomas said quietly, "that you've got about 10 seconds to get out of this canyon before I forget I'm a civilized man." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, Buck Morrison spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around. "This ain't finished," he called over his shoulder as they rode out. Thomas kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared from sight, then slowly lowered the weapon. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and he realized how close they had all come to violence that would have solved nothing. Running Deer climbed down from her perch and joined him beside the boulder. "You could have killed them," she observed. "Killing's easy," Thomas replied. "It's learning to live with it afterward that's hard." They broke camp quickly, both aware that Buck Morrison might return with more men. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Running Deer turned to Thomas with a serious expression. "There is something I must tell you," she said. "Something that will change everything between us." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What is it?" Running Deer took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult confession. "My father is not just a leader among my people. He is the principal chief of all the Apache bands in this region. I am his daughter, and what happened to me yesterday, it is not just a personal shame. It is an insult to our entire nation." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. By helping Running Deer, by confronting her attackers, he had involved himself in politics that went far beyond a simple case of right and wrong. If the Apache chose to see his actions as interference, or if Buck Morrison and his friends decided to make trouble by spreading their version of events, the consequences could be severe for everyone involved. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Thomas asked. "Because I wanted to know who you truly were," Running Deer replied. "Many white men would help a poor Apache woman out of pity or guilt. Far fewer would help the daughter of a chief, knowing it might bring trouble to themselves." Thomas considered this for a long moment. "So what happens now?" "Now you must meet my father," Running Deer said simply. "He will want to thank the man who restored his daughter's honor, and he will want to judge for himself whether you can be trusted." The journey to the Apache camp took them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country Thomas had ever seen. They traveled through high mesas and hidden valleys, past ancient ruins and sacred sites that Running Deer spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. The land itself seemed to pulse with life and history, every rock and tree part of a story that stretched back countless generations. As they rode, Running Deer shared more of her people's ways, teaching Thomas words in her language and explaining the complex relationships between the various Apache bands. She spoke of her father, Chief Standing Bear, as a man trying to balance the old ways with the realities of an encroaching white civilization. "He has seen what happened to other tribes who chose only war," Running Deer explained. "He has also seen what happened to those who trusted too easily in white promises. He seeks a third path, one that preserves our people while acknowledging that the world has changed." Thomas found himself deeply impressed by this approach. It would have been easy for the Apache to choose either complete resistance or complete submission, but Standing Bear was apparently trying to navigate between these extremes while maintaining his people's dignity and independence. On the second day of their journey, they encountered the first Apache scouts. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as three warriors materialized from the landscape as if they had been part of the rocks and trees themselves. They were impressive men, clearly experienced fighters, and their expressions as they studied Thomas were not particularly welcoming. Running Deer spoke rapidly in Apache, explaining the situation. Thomas caught his own name several times, along with words that Running Deer had taught him meant friend and honor. The scouts' expressions gradually shifted from suspicion to curiosity, though they remained alert and ready for trouble. One of the scouts, a man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, spoke directly to Thomas in accented English. "You are the one who helped our chief's daughter." "I am," Thomas replied simply. The scout studied him for a long moment. "Why did you do this thing?" Thomas had been asked this question before, but somehow it carried more weight coming from this Apache warrior. "Because it was right," he said finally. The scout nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied him. "Come, Chief Standing Bear waits." The Apache camp was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. It was not a permanent settlement, but rather a carefully organized collection of temporary structures that could be moved quickly if necessary. Wickiups made from bent saplings and covered with hides provided shelter, while cook fires sent thin streams of smoke into the clear desert air. What struck Thomas most forcefully was the sense of community that permeated the camp. Children played games while their mothers worked on various crafts, elderly people shared stories and wisdom, and warriors discussed hunting and defense. Despite the harsh realities of their situation caught between an advancing white civilization and their own ancient traditions, these people had maintained their dignity and their culture. Chief Standing Bear was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. Perhaps 50 years old, he possessed the kind of presence that came from years of making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. His weathered face spoke of countless hours spent in the sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as he studied Thomas from head to toe. The meeting took place in the chief's wickiup, with Running Deer serving as translator when necessary. Thomas found himself facing not just Standing Bear, but also several other tribal leaders, all of whom had clearly heard the story of recent events and had formed their own opinions about this white cowboy who had involved himself in Apache affairs. "My daughter tells me you helped her when she was in need," Standing Bear said in carefully pronounced English. "She also tells me you faced 3 armed men to return her belongings." "That's true, sir," Thomas replied respectfully. "Why did you do this thing?" the chief asked, echoing the question his scout had posed. Thomas looked around the circle of weathered faces, all of them watching him intently. "Because she needed help, and I was there to give it. Where I come from, that's what decent people do for each other." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "And what do you want in return for this help?" The question caught Thomas off guard. In truth, he hadn't thought much about what he wanted. The events of the past few days had unfolded so quickly that he had been reacting rather than planning. "Nothing, sir," Thomas said finally. "I don't help people because I expect something back. I help them because it's the right thing to do." One of the other tribal leaders, an elderly man with fierce eyes, spoke rapidly in Apache. Standing Bear listened carefully, then replied in the same language. A brief discussion followed, with several people speaking at once. Running Deer leaned close to Thomas and whispered, "They are debating whether you can be trusted. Some believe all white men are the same. Others point to your actions as proof that there are exceptions." Finally, Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. "Thomas McKenna," he said formally, "you have shown honor in your treatment of my daughter. You have shown courage in facing her enemies. But there are some among my people who believe that accepting help from whites is the first step toward losing our independence." Thomas felt his heart sinking. Despite everything that had happened, despite the connection he felt with Running Deer, and the respect he had developed for her people, it seemed he was still an outsider. However, Standing Bear continued, "I am chief not just because of my blood, but because of my judgment. And my judgment tells me that you are a man of honor. You are welcome in our camp as a friend." The relief that washed over Thomas was almost overwhelming. Around the circle, he could see that not everyone agreed with the chief's decision, but the authority in Standing Bear's voice made it clear that the matter was settled. "There is one more thing," Standing Bear added. "My daughter is of marriageable age, and by your actions you have placed yourself in the position of her protector. Among our people, this creates certain expectations." Thomas felt his face flush as the implications became clear. Running Deer, sitting beside her father, was staring at the ground, but he could see the color rising in her cheeks as well. I hadn't thought about it that way, sir," Thomas stammered. Standing Bear's expression remained serious, but Thomas thought he detected a hint of amusement in the chief's eyes. "Perhaps it is time you did think about it, Thomas McKenna. My daughter is not a woman to be protected and then abandoned. If you wish to remain in her life, you must be prepared to remain permanently." The weight of decision settled on Thomas's shoulders like a physical burden. Just days ago, he had been a drifting cowboy with no ties and no responsibilities beyond caring for his horse and finding his next meal. Now he was being offered a place among people whose ways were foreign to him, a chance at love with a woman who had already changed his understanding of the world. Thomas looked at Running Deer, who finally raised her eyes to meet his. In her gaze, he saw the same uncertainty he felt, but also something else: hope, affection, and the possibility of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. "If Running Deer will have me," Thomas said quietly, "then I would be honored to make my life among your people." The smile that lit Running Deer's face was answer enough. Standing Bear nodded approvingly, and even some of the skeptical tribal leaders seemed pleased by Thomas's response. As the formal meeting broke up and people began to drift away, Thomas found himself alone with Running Deer outside the chief's wickiup. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the entire world ablaze. "Are you certain about this?" Running Deer asked softly. "Life among my people will not be easy for you. You will have to learn our ways, our language, our beliefs. Some will never fully accept you." Thomas took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they seemed to fit together. "I've been drifting for years, looking for something without really knowing what it was. Now I know I was looking for home. And home isn't a place. It's the people you choose to be with." Running Deer's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Then you truly wish to stay?" "I truly wish to stay," Thomas confirmed. "If you'll have me." Instead of answering with words, Running Deer rose on her tiptoes and kissed him softly. It was a kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings, of courage in the face of uncertainty, and of love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. As they stood together in the gathering darkness, both Thomas and Running Deer knew that their path would not be easy. There would be challenges from both their peoples, difficulties in bridging two very different worlds, and the constant struggle to build something new while honoring what had come before. But they also knew that what they had found together was worth fighting for. In helping a stranger in distress, Thomas had discovered not just love, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly human. In accepting help from an unlikely source, Running Deer had learned that trust could still exist between people of different races and backgrounds. Their story had begun with a cry for help beside a peaceful lake, but it would continue as a testament to the power of compassion to transform lives and bridge seemingly impossible divides. In choosing each other, they had chosen hope over fear, love over prejudice, and the future over the past. The stars wheeled overhead as they made their plans. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the vast expanse of the American Southwest. It was a sound as old as the land itself, speaking of connections that transcended species and boundaries, of the eternal search for companionship in a sometimes lonely world. Thomas McKenna had ridden into the desert as a solitary man seeking work. He would remain as part of a family, part of a community, part of something larger than himself. And it had all begun with a simple choice to help someone in need, a choice that proved the power of individual action to change the course of multiple lives. In the Apache camp that night, as Thomas learned his first words of his new family's language, and Running Deer taught him the customs he would need to know, both understood that they had become part of a story that was still being written. It was a story of courage and compassion, of love transcending cultural barriers, and of the truth that home is not where you come from, but where you choose to belong. The desert wind carried their quiet conversation into the star-filled night, where it joined the eternal chorus of all who had ever dared to hope for something better, something truer, something worth the risk of changing everything they had ever known for the chance at a love that could transform the world.